I put together this session really about scaling psychedelics. And I thought first I'll talk about what kind of scaling psychedelics means to me, which is basically getting access for a broader group of people and getting kind of equitable access where we can get to a place where anyone can access psychedelics, and irrespective of their financial means or their cultural or social capital. Because we know access to psychedelics at the moment is an issue, and only a few people really can access them. And this isn't a problem just of clinical trials, also in retreats or even recreationally. We know use is really confined to a very small group of often quite privileged individuals that aren't particularly diverse. So wider access can look like all sorts of things, really. One of the things could be changing drug policy, which is obviously one of the key things. Also changing attitudes. But there's one of the many ways which we can increase access to psychedelics is to kind of make them accessible within existing democratized vehicles. And one of those is a public healthcare system. So I appreciate this isn't possible everywhere around the world. Because, for instance, the US don't have a public healthcare system, but we do here in the UK just about. And even though it's kind of creaking and ailing, it's still there, and it's an infrastructure through which we can widen access to these substances. And people do still trust in the NHS, and maybe a little less than they did before, but they'll turn to it in times of trouble. It's a place where psychedelics can reach a wider audience. So I'm currently leading a phase 3 trial of ketamine-assisted therapy here in the UK. So we've got it running across 8 sites in the NHS, soon to be 10. We're recruiting 280 people to that. And if we're successful at this stage in showing an effect, we'll be able to roll out this treatment more widely, hopefully. And we're also participating in a pilot with David Rizzo, who most of you probably know is at Imperial, but also CNWL, where they're looking at giving ketamine for treatment-resistant depression alongside therapy in the NHS. So that's a kind of pilot they'll be running here in Devon as well as in CNWL. So I thought it might be interesting to talk about this way of kind of getting ketamine in and psychedelic-assisted therapies generally into the NHS. I'm not saying, this is the best approach, to add it into public healthcare systems, just one approach and one that suits us here in the UK. So the approach I've called ketamine the Trojan horse tranquilizer. It's my little joke. This is basically what I mean by a Trojan horse tranquilizer, or just a Trojan horse, is basically ketamine might be a vehicle by which we can get psychedelics more broadly into these public healthcare systems, into the NHS. Which might be potentially easier and more acceptable than just starting with psychedelic therapies. And I guess the eventual aim of that would be to try and build an infrastructure to eventually roll out other psychedelic therapy more widely. And potentially, obviously, expand to other psychedelics with less baggage than ketamine. And I guess my quite naive hope potentially is that perhaps in doing so, we'll be able to transform the mental health care system from the inside. But yeah, who knows whether that will happen. So when I say I want to use ketamine as a Trojan horse tranquilizer, you're probably thinking ketamine, because ketamine is basically like the wrong one of psychedelics. I think it's thought of as the kind of the poor relative, the kind of dirty little cousin, and it is problematic. And there's reasons why that people think of it in this way, I think. And so actually, though, I think if you were here for Shannon and Phil's excellent talk earlier about ketamine-assisted therapy, which is so kind of heartful, you'll see that it does have its place within therapy, but it also does have its issues. Ketamine is addictive, so we've done research on this, and actually, I don't know if Bex Harding is here. We've got a paper coming out next week, actually, about ketamine addiction, which Bex is first author of, and looking at treatment needs here in the UK. So we know that for people that get seduced by ketamine in this way, it has really serious consequences. So it causes really serious physical health problems, damage to your bladder and kidneys, and also can increase risks of things like accidents. Matthew Perry was by far not the first person to drown due to their ketamine addiction. So we know that ketamine does have some really negative side effects associated with it. And if it didn't have a bad enough image problem, then this guy started saying how much ketamine he does all the time and went on to try and destroy everything. But as with all drugs, I guess, and life in general, context is key. And as we saw with the amazing work that Phil and Shannon were talking about at Roots to Thrive, I think it is possible to build a safe container around ketamine treatment. And I think, we research ketamine addiction, so we do have an insight into this. And I feel that, strongly that we can do this. It just takes quite a lot of care in order to be able to do so. So even though ketamine is a bit of a wrong one, potentially, it's also a bit of a right one when we think about this kind of Trojan horse idea, because it's suited to being a kind of Trojan horse tranquilizer, not only because it's called a horse tranquilizer and a kind of Trojan horse empathogen doesn't really work as a joke, but it also has some special properties that make it quite well suited to kind of integrating into our existing healthcare system. So one of those is its duration of action. It's quite short in action compared to your kind of proper psychedelics, and yet it still produces these robust kind of ego dissolution, potentially ego death, feelings of connection, profound changes in perception, these kind of noetic feelings of mystical experiences. And something interesting about ketamine, I think, is it also, unlike other psychedelics, has these kind of anxiolytic effects. So it's kind of anxiety reducing and analgesic properties, which is why it's so prevalent in healthcare. So it kind of reduces pain. And I think you can see that with working with people with ketamine sometimes in approaching some of these difficult situations. They can do so from a place of kind of a greater sort of separation and with less pain than they would with a kind of classic psychedelic. So in that respect, it might be potentially easier to work with. I also think potentially, and Irene, who's in the audience, will probably know this better than me, but I feel like there's less evidence of extended psychological difficulties. I don't know, Irene, if that's true, with ketamine. Maybe potentially because of these anxiolytic effects. So, I mean, although those are rare in most cases anyway, but these kind of prolonged psychological difficulties, although ketamine's obviously associated with a whole other profile of difficulties. I mean, I guess the kind of most attractive quality of it as a kind of Trojan horse chemical is that it's Schedule 2. So people can prescribe it anywhere in the world, and it's used in hospitals all around the world every single day. It's also cheap as chips. It's, pence or cents, depending where you come from. It's a really cheap drug, and you can get it from the pharmacy, and clinicians kind of trust it because of this. You can look it up. You can look up its side effects, its profile of effects, because it's already licensed. And so when we started our work with ketamine, it wasn't licensed as an antidepressant, but as Rick was talking about, Janssen went on to license Spravato. And that was kind of an interesting process because that was licensed as a kind of standalone medication and badged as a rapid-acting antidepressant. And people kind of ignored in some ways that it had these weird side effects. So it sort of Trojan horsed its way into the psychiatric consciousness, really in a way ignoring its psychedelic effects. So, and interestingly, actually, in biological psychiatry, there's been a huge research effort devoted to trying to find ketamine without ketamine effects. So ketamine that doesn't make you dissociate or doesn't make you have kind of ego death. And it's been entirely fruitless. But within that tradition, these kind of psychedelic effects that we feel are kind of important are seen as a nuisance adverse effect. And I guess we've seen this replicated in psychedelic and the psychoplastogens research with psychedelics more generally, where people are looking for psychedelics without psychedelic effects. But it's kind of interesting. And I suppose that sort of helps with this kind of idea of infiltrating the mental health care system, that we can kind of act normal, like this is just another normal antidepressant, which it seems kind of anathema to the psychedelics field, where we don't want to act normal necessarily, but it is the kind of approach that people have taken in psychedelic mainstreaming more generally. I guess the dream would be for ketamine to be boring, and then everyone would be, all clinicians would be happy using it, but I think that's unlikely to happen. So we kind of enhance this normalization of ketamine by focusing on biological mechanisms in how we explain it, which gives the impression we can kind of measure and capture these effects. So in order to really infiltrate public healthcare systems, I think we kind of, we need to find a frictionless way to integrate these treatments. So find treatments that will kind of slide in, because I think public healthcare systems are quite scared of change. Not the individuals within them who can be quite passionate about wanting to change the system, but if you lack resource and capacity, the system as a whole is kind of quite risk averse. And so that's why we need to find ways to kind of slip in these treatments in the best way that we can. So then again, that's an amazing capacity of ketamine, really, that it's on the World Health Organization's list of essential medicines. Yeah, and we give it to kids, which I guess is something to sell the drug to states' healthcare systems. So another approach, I guess, that we've taken with our work is to kind of get buy-in from the right organisations from the start. So most of our fundings come from state healthcare, or either from the NHS or from the UK government. And I think that buy-in from the start of this kind of research effort has been helpful for the credibility. So should we find positive results? Because we've been through these kind of grant application processes of the literal buy-in of the state. And people know that it's been independently reviewed. You go through iterations of the design, which is evaluated and then critiqued and updated. And this kind of contrasts with commercial funders potentially, who have different levers and drivers behind their study design. And I guess with this kind of state-related research, we might have a greater window of tolerance around failure. I don't know if that's true, but I feel that that's the case with these kind of funding systems. And also, as a function of being funded by things like the NIHR, we've been encouraged from the start to think about cost effectiveness, which, is not ideal in this setting, but I think is important if we want these treatments to be rolled out more widely. Also, the NIHR insists on you having a very kind of developed public engagement strategy. So we've been working with service users, with people working in services, also with commissioners from the start of this to figure out how we might roll out these treatments if we do find positive effects. And also we have to, in terms of our therapy, we were quite kind of limited because we're introducing ketamine, which is unusual anyway in these grants, that we actually had to use kind of nice recommended therapies. So for our study, we're working with people with alcohol use disorder. We've been using mindfulness-based relapse prevention, adapted to work with ketamine, but we're kind of limited to using evidence-based therapies in a way that maybe other commercial studies aren't. So I guess we have to kind of try and fit in to a system that might not necessarily want us. It's all well and good to come up with a brilliant treatment, but in public healthcare, if it's too expensive, then in our NHS, then it just won't be used. So Rick was talking about Spravato or esketamine, which is the Janssen product. That's not recommended by our NICE, our organisation here, that gives guidelines on what treatments can be prescribed, because it's too expensive. So we have to think about this from the outset, because if we design a treatment that's too expensive, then it will limit its scaling because it won't be recommended by NICE here in the UK. Related to the work that Maria and Tim were talking about with dyads, and that's incredibly impressive. I think we have to think really carefully about what are the components of therapy that we want to keep, or these treatments, and when we're thinking about scaling them. So from our work, and then I guess Rick I sort of alluded to a minimum viable product. And so I always have these horrible images or a minimum viable solution that's some sort of really kind of cobbled together thing like this. But actually we can just keep the best bits of the treatment and make something that's efficient that will work within our public healthcare systems. So one thing that we thought we wouldn't compromise on was including therapy, particularly as we're working with people with alcohol use disorder. And this is potentially addictive substance, so we wanted to provide a container around that. It's interesting as well. So these are the data from one of our phase 2 trials, and actually, I don't know if you can see on that graph, the line in yellow is the ketamine and psychotherapy, and the line in green is ketamine and psychoeducation. And although the therapy arm did better than the arm with education, there wasn't actually a statistically significant difference between those two groups. There was just a difference between the ketamine and the placebo groups. But we felt really strongly, so this could have been, I guess, if we're in different circumstances, an argument to drop the therapy and just use psychoeducation, which was our therapy control in this study. But actually we felt really strongly that it was really important to have therapy alongside this. And we were using a model of relatively unskilled therapists. So actually maybe when it's rolled out that we would have even more better skilled therapists delivering this, and it may work better. I guess that's a contrast with the commercial world, where a lot of commercial companies, as Rick was discussing, have kind of pulled back on therapy because of concerns that the FDA can't regulate it. So from our work in phase 2, so things that we kind of needed, we thought to keep, there that we actually wanted to keep. So one was the therapeutic container. Another one was the container for the experience. So we wanted people to treat the experience with a kind of gravity that it deserves. And whether, we're trying to roll this out across a number of sites. I'm not sure whether this is definitely happening in every site. But that was one of the things we felt was really important. It's a difficulty to know how to train people to do that, especially with people with varying different experiences. So that's a kind of work in process, I think. Something that came out of our phase 2 study was that people asked, that our patients actually asked if they could meet people who'd had similar experiences. This wasn't something that we'd included before, but now, so we've built in a peer support kind of integration group that follows the main trial. And my hope would be if this was rolled out more widely as a treatment, that that's something that would continue. So a space for people to kind of make meaning out of their experiences in a way that we don't normally see in clinical trials. And the other thing that's been highlighted relatively recently to us really is in terms of our therapists. So we have a range of therapists who've got different experiences of psychedelics. So some of them have no personal experience. Oh, is it nearly time? Yeah, sorry. And so what we kind of, and Flora Fraser, I don't know if she's here, but she's around here somewhere, I kind of identified this, and she's absolutely amazing, that we need to develop a cosmology for these therapists, really, to understand what's going on in this process. And so that's a work in process now. So we're hoping to kind of create a space not only for the people taking part in the treatment to develop a meaning making around it, but also for the therapists. And then in terms of the therapy, and Rick mentioned how difficult it is in the US to get payers to pay for therapy, but we're lucky here in the UK that we have the NHS Talking Therapy Service, which has got a large number of relatively lower skilled therapists that are cheaper than clinical psychologists that we can skill up. So this is where we're kind of aiming some of this work. So yeah, just to, I think we're about to get on to our panel. But yeah, so to kind of update my ketamine Trojan horse tranquilizer. I think that what we're smuggling in is not necessarily just psychedelics in general, but maybe a different kind of experience and a different way of holding that experience in healthcare systems. And I guess a lot of people might argue whether psychedelics should be in healthcare systems at all, and that we should maybe be addressing the causes of mental health problems, not the symptoms. And people have also argued that the horse is important, like what kind of horse you use. If you're smuggling as an antidepressant, that's necessarily going to constrain it. But to my mind, maybe that underestimates a little bit the power of these substances. And this is just something from a qualitative analysis from our phase 2 study. And this just is some findings of connectedness in people. And this is a very kind of pared down psychological therapy. But this person said, the sense of what was important was my relationship with the universe and the universe as a whole, and therefore those relationships with people and other entities, nature, wildlife, and I was a part of that, a tiny part of that, but that's where I fitted. So that these processes are happening even in, a very kind of pared down ketamine-assisted therapy within public healthcare gives me kind of heart that maybe bringing these treatments into the system might have the capacity to change it. Other people say, you can't change a system really if you're complicit in it. But I think, well, and not just I think, systems change theorists think that systems change can happen in different ways, on many different levels, and from many different angles. If we think about, say, poverty, you can tackle the root causes of poverty, and this will help people over time. But we can't let people starve right now. And I guess that's kind of balancing the need for systems change with also like pressing demands. We've got a pressing mental health demand. And so hopefully, and by introducing these treatments, it's something we might address. And yeah, I guess my maybe naive view is that they might change the systems themselves. And so that maybe over time, what was a Trojan horse, I think I'm really pushing this metaphor too far, will develop into a psychedelic unicorn. So I just wanted to say thanks. There's so many people involved in this work. I particularly wanted to thank, I can see one of them from here, the therapists that are involved in our phase 3 trial, because they have been endlessly patient with us, and it's an evolving process. So thanks, Olivia. I can see you. Thanks, everyone. And this is a QR code for Exeter if you want to get involved.